Hi, Lisa.
Good afternoon today.
Thank you so much for joining me. I'm so excited to talk to you today because we officially met in person a few weeks ago at a very special place, the Royal Yacht Squadron Castle in Cowes in the Isle of Wight, for the third sustainability symposium held by the OIS. And yet we really did not get much time to talk at that event. So I kind of want to place us back there to start with and kind of work backwards in this winding journey of a podcast chat, because I'm quite fascinated that you, first of all, found Floating Stories Lab and our work and became a very, very important member of our association not that long ago, but rocked up to the Royal Yacht Squadron event to support us. So I want to know a little bit more about how you ended up there, that particular event, and also your perspective from it.
Right. Well, I think that everything comes in its own due time, right? And our paths to connect finally here. You're now in France back home, and I'm here still in Cowes on the Isle of Wight. And I've been connected with your work when I arrived to Suffolk in East England last summer. And the connection, I think, quite timely, because the work that I feel that Floating Stories is bringing to light and to life is important now more than ever, between the work with the Warren boat build, which is actually how I became connected to your work through craft heritage boat building. But then also what really I think is has the potential on scale as to elevate the work that you're doing around monitoring decommissioned boats and the impact that they do have on our waterways, not just here in northern France or southern England, but also globally. So the Royal Yacht Squadron, I think, has a unique role as sailors, which we both are, to provide really strong leadership, I think, as convener from the whole gamut of industries that have a stake in our waterways, and also then by extension, healing our communities, food systems, not just waterways, but all the ancillary things that we need to survive as humans on the planet. So that's a bit of a long arc. It didn't get too nitty gritty, but I'm really excited to be connected to the work and excited for the potential that we have through Floating Stories and the boat monitoring work as well.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I really like that you brought up that whole holistic perspective. So for those who are listening and don't know what the Royal Yacht Squadron is, I didn't really know much about. I mean, it's not an association, it's an organization, and I knew rarely anything really before going in. And then, as honorable guests, myself and Dr. Karuna can walk into this castle that is really like a living museum of sailing history, and that they're facilitating these every 2 years sustainability symposiums is really, really great to see that they want to be on the right side of where the marine industry moves forward. And, they have a big legacy of racing, and racing is obviously quite a high impact sport in this industry, to be honest. One of the women that I spent like 3 evenings sharing wines and conversations with, who's a senior member, she's been involved for a long time, and her husband has generational ties to the OIS. She made this really beautiful comment to me where she was like, we're here for sustainability, but the meals, there's just too much waste at the end of these meals they're serving at this event. And back in the day, we used to serve ourselves and it was more proportional, and now it's all plated. And I went to the chef and I asked him about it. And I compost at home, and why is there no compost garden here? So it was really cool because the symposium was quite macro, with a theme on innovation. And then she was just like, hang on a minute, we've got to, put our mouth, like where our feet are and vice versa, and take action from the micro as well. So I just want to kind of circle back to the actual place where we exchanged for a few days, and some of the dialogue that came up over that event from your perspective. You know, you were there, not staying there as Corinna and I were, but you were there for the whole weekend, as more of, you know, like a community stakeholder interested in the dialogue going about. So from my side as a presenter, you know, I have my experience, but I really want to know from your side how your experiences was and what are some of the things that came up for you from that event.
Well, I think I appreciate that you talk about lunch, and a few angles of it, right? So those listening will recognize that I'm from the States. I'm not from England, and first and foremost, you know, I'm from the Great Lakes area. More recently, New York, but from the Great Lakes. And as from my childhood, growing up 5 minutes from Lake Michigan in a family of engineers and sailors, I was taught that the natural world is the best engineer possible, right? And so when we would go out, you know, we would go out to the boat, to the marina, out to the water, you know, even in our home was designed I had a very eclectic childhood, actually. But my dad was always nudging me to consider the natural systems of things, and that the water was absolutely the most important resource that we could possibly have, and to protect it. And lucky enough that, you know, in our boat shed, he's also a woodworker and a metallurgist. So I grew up with an entire set of sheds where I watched him bring a lot of ideas to life through craft. And so I was able to learn the stories of the hardwoods, the mahoganies, and all these different elements, and the benefits of pollinators, and how, you know, how necessary it is to consider holistically this ecosystem that we live. So that, I think, foundationally is part of my DNA. And growing up in the Great Lakes with nearly 30% of the world's fresh water, once you start to include all the ancillary tributaries and riverway systems, I grew up very dedicated to protecting and defending and promoting work that, by extension, really does make sure that we safeguard those freshwater resources for not only our children, but 7 generations forward. And for a long time, I think, would always consider, as a sailor, everything from the scows. You know, my dad's first scow was a wooden scow from back in the day, but, you know, growing up in fiberglass boats, college sailing, of course, you know, then ocean sailing, big boat sailing, lots of the ways that we manufacture boats today do have a direct impact on what we do. And then, of course, you know, when we talk about events and the racing circuit, that is its own bucket of opportunity where we can really look critically at how that entire system can be considered to move toward a less impactful, more regenerative way of sailing. And it's only natural, right? We rely on these water systems for our sport, and, though more importantly, for our livelihood. And I think that, again, the Royal Yacht Squadron, being cows, not just as one of the oldest clubs in the world, but also in such an iconic place of boat building. So the Isle of Wight has its own, and the Solent in general, on both sides of the Solent, have a very long tradition, several thousands of years. If we want to go back to, you know, pre-Roman, right? the archaeologist and anthropologist in me really, like, let's look at the long arc of our boat heritage. How might we look at the historic and prehistoric ways of innovation and infuse that, looking forward into what's possible? So for me, I look at these dimensions, this dimensionality of where we are here on the Solent, our deep heritage and craft and boat building. And then again, while our RYS has a certain cadence to this symposium that they're hosting, I think there's a real opportunity to put power and momentum behind it. Again, to elevate the innovation work in the maritime industry, as well as engaging citizens that might not even have ever been sailing, right? Or even been to the ocean, or have, in our DNA, we've had these experiences, but many, 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 many parts of the world have never had that privilege or luxury. So this is where I think there's a real opportunity for the work that you're doing, to connect people to a source of what really makes us human.
Beautiful. There's so much to unpack in what you said, and we're going to do that in a very non-linear way. You brought up, I guess you kind of teased the traditional ecological knowledge, and I think in speaking of innovation, that was probably what I felt was missing from that symposium in particular, but all of the conferences that I've particularly been invited to attend or present at recently in the context of making the marine industry more sustainable or addressing the end-of-life boats, negative impact pollution issue. This idea that innovation is something that is only new and with advanced technology just seems to be very whitewashed to me. And I would love to just dive in there a little bit. And if we can, let's see how we can do this. But your background growing up in what I would probably say is my husband's dream environment, all these different making sheds. I'm really interested, from being an American growing up in that particular environment, this intersection of making and craft, and how that's kind of driven you to have these regenerative perspectives and regenerative practices, because your background is really interesting in that you have quite a solid land base in terms of the work you've done and the books you've written, from foraging and herbalism. And it's it crosses really nicely into the backstories of materials that we're uncovering by accident in the process of building our Narai 4, the Floating Stories Lab, wanting to go and trace the supply chain backwards. In a sense, I feel like where you grew up, that just became second nature to you. So I don't know, can we riff off of that?
Yeah, well, I have to say, one, thank you for being able to make those connections. I had like I had said before, I had a very eclectic background. So I was lucky enough. I also was, growing up, I always was highly aware that not all families, composted or had maker sheds, or, very, very rich childhoods. And I thank my parents for that, especially my father, who is quite impassioned when you talk about having such a land ethos in my food systems. Regenerative agriculture, I would say, is a massive pillar of expertise in my professional career. That, I don't want to say that came accidentally, but as a child, my mother, fortunately, more out of economy than anything else, kept a garden. She knew how to can. She, for economy's sake, we knew how to making soups, making food from scratch. Today, it's now, quite a trend, right? To be able, the farm to table movement in the United States, the slow food movement out of Italy. It's in my upbringing, that is just something that we did. So that part and parcel, the Great Lakes region as well produces the second most diversity of food variety because of the microclimates that California produces for the United States. Now, that's really, really, really significant as well. The number one pollutant in our Great Lakes actually is agricultural runoff. So these things all combined, I think, played a role in my POV, I think, going forward as an adult. Now, my mother, amazing cook, but nothing fancy. So it wasn't until later on, until I went to university and moved abroad, lived in Nice for school, that I did I actually learn some of the more, I want to say exotic. The Midwest is not exotic. Very much meat and potatoes. My family, my family background is very much English, so very, very good staple foods, right? And I think that just having then the expansive knowledge of and curiosity around how humans have worked with food or with the natural world for food, shelter, medicine, economy, really became it's just a fascinating intersection of topics. So, again, that's really tangential, but also I think that when you do talk about water is that key element that factors into food production, factors into maintaining our industries, all these different elements. So really it does boil back to the way that we maintain our water systems will really define the health and quality, as we know, of the land-based ecosystems across the world.
Yeah, this living systems perspective as well seems to be missing, like I said, from a lot of these conferences and dialogues that I'm participating of late. You originally were talking about boats and bees in the same sentence, which is so fantastic because we're having these conversations with Pascal, our advisor. We just saw him yesterday and we were talking again about, I was giving him a lot of updates and talking about the Royal Yacht Squadron event. And he always says, thank God for composites, because otherwise, we would have chopped down all the trees to make boats, right? And he said, don't ever forget that the most sustainable boat is not building a boat or not having a boat at all. And this is true in actual modern research. There's a report that we have on our website which addresses sustainability considerations of end-of-life boats. And there's a fantastic table. This was, published by a composites professor and a team in the UK. And there's this wonderful table, and it kind of starts with like the most sustainable kind of options and then works down to what we really need to phase out. And number one is like discourage marine leisure activities with a question mark, right? So our cultures have moved from marine craft, as I would say probably always there's been a leisure extent there, because I think it's fair to presume that humans had leisure in our DNA like all along, but was very much a transportation or a need, to the point where like we're at this like drastic other end of the scale from a leisure perspective now with recreational boating and boats being built for recreation just skyrocketing, especially after COVID. And Corinna has a fabulous graph about boat consumption going up like this. I'm talking about recreational still here. And then it just brings up so many different things about like, on this table as well of sustainability. I think number 2 or 3 is co-sharing boats. Like, we're building a new boat at the Floating Stories Lab, but it's a community boat. It is going to be shared. So not one boat per person. And so that's very interesting. Like, you've come from this background where those things have kind of always been kind of interconnected, these boats to bees and economy and things like that. And I think it needs to go back that way. But I don't want go back to be romanticized or also feared as this giving up. And this is where I circle back to the traditional ecological knowledge as innovation. And so that gets me to wanting to ask all about how you ended up in Suffolk and the project you were working on there, because pure serendipity is that several members of the Floating Stories Lab, Lisa, who's also building a warren just north of London, and Hanneke Boone, Belinda, these guys are all on our Wooden Boatopia Council. We're actually visiting the place where you've been doing some work for their end of year Christmas party for the women in boat building. So I originally thought that's how you found us. I'm not sure if that's exactly, yeah. But
That's exactly true.
for many people probably aren't aware of that project, I had to do some research and Remy has no idea. So if we're talking to people who have no idea, can you please introduce her and how the hell you got there?
Well, I got there. Yeah, it's a really funny story. So, my academic training is classically as an anthropologist, which in and of itself is a practice that has very colonial imperialistic roots, right, as a discipline. I actually, thanks to my dad's going to get lots of props and shout outs in this whole chat. I was a music student originally, and he's like, how does this link to Suffolk? It does. I was a music student and I had, a scholarship to music conservatory, and the week before university started, I was a bit overwhelmed, and I said to my dad, I said, I don't want to live in a practice room through all of my studies. I went to figure out my classes, and it was stacked deep with all music theory, which is everything that I love. But I was like, when am I going to go to the beach? When am I going to go sailing? Wait, when am I going to get outside? This is not a life that I want. My dad said, well, why don't you consider anthropology and archaeology? And that he was really interested in archaeology specifically. But from the anthropology perspective, he's like, that will set you up to consider some of these massive systems challenges that face the world. He's absolutely right. We couldn't have this dialogue today had he really not known what I was interested in, and then set me off in that course. So after university, I spent, and this is relevant because I spent nearly 15, almost 20 years in first half of my career in the nonprofit sector, second half in the corporate sector. About 2 years ago, I made a pivot. My children are now older, past university age. And I really wanted to say, okay, what next? What does the world need from me? And what do I also want in terms of avenues to express the things that I see and the connections that I understand, and how can I add value? So I chose to go back and really focus on go back to my roots, go back to some of the archaeology, go back to my maritime interests, go back to the archaeology. Kind of like, where did I leave off before I had children? I had to pay bills. I mean, I still have to pay bills, don't get me wrong. But just wanted to take a beat and say, how do I revisit my own way of living as well? Like what you're saying about boat building, co-sharing, like I want to have a life of joy. I don't want to give up my sailing. Does that mean I share? Does that mean, I downsized considerably to be able to, move more lightly in the world, to have a lighter footprint? I want to go forward in a way that is collaborative, that is more of a sharing-based economy. So I was looking at this and considering a move toward Europe for a time. And Suffolk is the home of a massive historic archaeology site known as Sutton Hoo. And Sutton Hoo is in East Anglia, East England, just Ipswich would be it's about 30 minutes north of Ipswich, off the North Sea. And it is the archaeology site and burial ground of a 7th century Anglo-Saxon king. And this burial site's pretty significant, and the entire burial ground is significant because within one of the burials was this countersunk 25-meter clinker-built English oak ship. Now, it's not, people will frequently call it a Viking ship. This is pre-Viking, so Anglo-Saxon period. The Romans left England in 400. The Anglo-Saxon period runs up to about the time of the Norman conquest. So this ship was interred at 625 when King Radwald had died. Now, there was no body found in the burial of the ship with all of these rich grave goods, but this ship is just this magical piece that was uncovered right around World War II. And so in Suffolk, just across from where this discovery was made, is this boat shed in Woodbridge. And in Woodbridge is a team of about 150 of us with a range of talents, reconstructing this longship using Anglo-Saxon boat building methods. And the construction, it is truly a reconstructive archaeology project. So reconstructing what was discovered in the archaeology has guided us to test and learn and to understand what might the methods have been going forward to make that ship. Now, I'm going to pause there. Have you been to the Longshed? We'll have to like get some slides and pictures to
Yeah, I like, this is blowing my mind. Did they find the ruins in the water or adjacent to the water?
So Sutton Hoo, as an Anglo-Saxon term, literally just means south-facing high point.
Oh, wow.
So discovery was made. For those listening, on Netflix is a movie that was made called The Dig, featuring Ralph Fiennes. It was released during the pandemic, and it's actually not, there's some creative latitude in the story, but it's not a bad historical fiction piece to give you a sense of what happened. And so this archaeological discovery was made actually in 1939 specifically. So the land that it was found is on this high point, and this ship was taken from the River Deben up the hill and interred as a burial ground. Now, it's part of a collection of 18 burial mounds across the site, and the time period of these burial mounds have a range all the way from the King Radwald times to early medieval period. So, and even actually pre-Anglo-Saxon times are there other burials across the site. But this boat was hauled up from the Deben, sunk into the ground, and used that as the burial grounds. Now it's a 25-meter clinker-built oak boat. I mean, that was a haul to get it up the hill. What was found? There was no mast deep found, so we have some interpretation from the archaeological record. Was it a sailing vessel? We don't know. Where the mast deep would have been was the burial chamber. There were no oars adjacent to the burial, but you haul a boat up a hill, you de-rig the whole thing anyway. So.
Yeah, you would think so. They weren't stupid.
Yeah, so the way that this project had been set up really, again, is with rigor and research to unpack what we know from the archaeology. But then we also have to fill in the gaps, because what we found and what we're trying to remake does require then also connecting with traditional boat builders from Norway, from the Viking traditions, from all over, actually, the United States. We've got a couple of boat builders on the project and whatnot. And so again, we're testing and learning and trying to understand how the boat was made, how it was used, and then with the intent to launch it at the end of hopefully end of 2026 into early 2027.
Back into the water, like the reconstruction will be a sailing boat, water-based.
Yep, the ship will be, the intention is to reconstruct the ship and then deploy it to trace the sailing routes and the economic sailing routes of the Anglo-Saxon period. Again, to understand, to give us, it's not just to build a boat, but to have this broader understanding, which I think when we talk today about the maritime industry, we look back to say, okay, what was the ecosystem of boat building at that time? What role did this ship have in that ecosystem? What were the adjacent capabilities? What was the natural world like? There are lots of different ancillary questions that we can understand or begin to understand, again, to your point, using traditional knowledge to help us inform what's possible for the future state of our boat building community, our sailing community, our maritime community, and more importantly, the health of our waterways. And that's really when I ended up in Suffolk to do not only the archaeology in the past summer with Time Team with the National Trust, but started volunteering quite a bit in the Longshed and becoming part of their research team to understand how might this type of project create dialogue and catalyze change. And that's when I discovered the Floating Stories Lab.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. I mean, I'm fascinated at how a project like this just creates all these tentacles of, well, of course, story, which is of key interest to me personally, but yeah, history, and there's so many like disciplines that can come together in unpacking the knowledge that can be there, right? And also knowledge of what not to do. That, you know, there may be some really good warning stories that come out of this, who knows? But I love that this is so multidisciplinary and there's so many people coming together on it. It shows a lot of hope for what's possible also in the marine industry. In terms of the materials that, of course, I was going to ask you about materials. So you said oak, clinker-built. Did they find any resins or paints, or what do you know about the materials?
So within the archaeology site, Sutton Hoo, the soil is really quite acidic. So all of the organic material within the site, with the exception of some of the adjacent textiles to ferrous materials, to the irons, really degraded nearly entirely. So what Basil Brown, he was the archaeologist over the excavation in 1938 and 39, what he uncovered, 39 specifically, what he uncovered ended up really being a ghost ship. And it was the findings of the rivets, and there were 2 ships discovered at Sutton Hoo, and it was the placement of the rivets that really helped, one, give the architecture of the hull, as well as the completely degraded planking of the entire hull. So there was no wood found from that. However, there were adjacent materials of resins. That's how we were able to identify the English oak adjacent and on the rivets themselves, which were a bog iron ferrous metal from a forged perspective. So amazing, gotta love science, and how exquisitely that site's been handled since the discovery from 1939 until today. There have been multiple different excavations with the British Museum involved, who now actually have most of the collection of artifacts within London. But the reconstruction of this ship really brings it to life and helps understand, again, like the supply chain. So it's not like you can go down, as I watch your discussion on tracing the supply chain of your woods for the Warham. This was English oak, but even as we reconstruct the longship, the biggest pain point is finding English oak of considerable size, and also health for fresh green timber to be able then to cleave into the planking for the strakes for the ship. So, you know, that in and of itself has been quite the journey of the reconstruction, because it's not like you can just order up, 15 massive logs. It's the Crown is no longer creating a timber source for fleets for the British Navy as it had done 400 years ago. Right.
And this brings up like new sustainability questions in this kind of, what do you call it? Is this boat archaeology, or did you call it reconstructive archaeology? What's the kind of field? Reconstructive archaeology?
It is a reconstructive. The project itself is contained to be a reconstructive archaeology project. So it's based out, and this is quite important because it's based on what was found in the archaeology that then set the plans forward. That would have been a different building style during Anglo-Saxon times, right? It would have been a much more organic relationship with materials. It also would have been done in like a fraction of the time, because the king tells you to make a boat, you make a boat much more quickly than a charity.
And you presume there's like a big pressure behind the reason he's needing a boat, like to switch, So
it was a royal vessel, right?
Okay.
That's
okay.
Yeah,
it wasn't
royal.
So that, okay, so the brings up like really interesting thoughts for me around tying straight back to sustainability again. So you obviously, to get the learnings that are there from this boat, you want to reconstruct it as close as possible to the way it was originally made with the same materials. But we live in a very different age today, and you know, I would absolutely love to be building my wareham out of Douglas fir, for example, because many wareham builders who have built boats in the past out of Douglas fir are just, you know, hold their hands up and say my boat is still going strong 50 years later. But we can't get Douglas fir anymore. That's the reality. We could if we really tried. It would be unsustainable and extremely uneconomical. So that's very interesting. Like that's a whole other component of sustainability discussion in the maritime industry. And I'm curious, obviously curious at the materials, the oak and whatever resins you found, because that's like, you know, pointing to materials that clearly have been able to last the test of time. But, you know, perhaps in a certain ecosystem as well, what might last 100 years in the Atlantic Ocean may not last, you know, a day in the South Pacific. Who knows? That's come up a lot in talks on materials, because you're trying to get a material that's going to last as long as possible, which is sort of how the composites industry just came out and went berserk, because you know, there's this idea that fiberglass and epoxy put together, even on a plywood boat like ours, is going to last forever. Well, newsflash, it doesn't last forever. Nothing lasts forever, even, you know, natural materials. But yeah, I'm curious of how the project, if at all, is impacted by, for example, like the difficulty in being able to source exactly the same materials and the questions around ethics there.
Yeah, well, I think the framework out the gate was to, when all entirely possible, like the design constraints, essentially, cost effectiveness, and, you know, it is built within a shed that has electricity with an occasional use of power tools, and health and safety design constraints. Right, there are some really realistic things that we have, you know, the guardrails for from a design perspective. The hand tools and the hand tools, the fact, the design of the boat itself, fortunately, has sustained the test of time. The clinker-built boat is something that you can buy even as a kit to build a dinghy with your children over the weekend, right? So that the design of the boat itself is, I don't want to say standardized, but it's something that's held up. That as well, the edge tools and the axes and the tools used for that shipbuilding at that time continue to be used today. So there's some continuity in the tool methods and tool making. So then, you know, from a reconstructive, there's materials and there's the tools. What do we use to make this, to reconstruct this ship? And so on the web for the Sutton Hoo Ships Company, you can see the different edge tools, from the axes and the cleaves to the finishing tools for shaping of the planks. And again, those sets of tools have continued today. You know, of course, they're made differently, but trying to stay true to the methods. Our boat builders are excellent woodworkers at the end of the day, right? So from a materials and designs constraints for the shaping of the wood, it is becoming, well, it is a threatened craft. It is an art. You know, Suffolk we had shut more recently, Lowestoft, the boat building school, just recently. I think there are only a few wooden boat building schools, if not more than two. I think there might only be two left within the UK in and of themselves, and I think it might be the same for the United States. So this ability to get a team of people together to reconstruct by hand and from whole trees a clinker-built boat, it's not the number of people able to do that aren't a lot, unfortunately. So that's, as we think of supply chain, we also need to think about the human capital and the human knowledge. And this is where I think the wisdom of what you're returning to, I don't want to, again, nostalgia becomes dangerous, but to try to retain and move forward traditional Polynesian boat building design is valuable, because there is what I love about working in the longshed and demonstrating some of the different components and the design, from the trennels and the use of the riveting and all of it. It's a very elegant, it's a clinker-built boat. It's not fancy, it's not sexy, but it's elegant. There's simplicity in the design. There's a beauty to it. There's no reason to riff on it or innovate on it. It holds up.
So Tyson Yunkaporta, who I always rave about, Australian academic author, and he's headed up the Indigenous Knowledge Systems Lab at the Deakin University. He always talks about remembering forward. So it's not, and this is, I think, especially important for Western folks, in wanting to not be cherry picking and romanticizing things from Indigenous knowledge or the past, that, counts for our own traditional ecological knowledge, which a lot of us forget we have that. If we just got to dig a little harder for it, perhaps. But remembering forward is like, I guess what James Wareham did and what Haneker has done over decades, and what we are doing now, is, taking this knowledge from, the incredible Polynesian seafarers, navigators, and boat builders, and remembering that forward and adapting it where relevant, where necessary, and then keeping the simplicity and the minimalism where relevant and necessary. So I'm really passionate at that as innovative, right? Like, not cherry picking, not extracting Indigenous knowledges and repackaging it, which I'm particularly think we need to be careful of doing, because it happens too much, especially in for-profit scenarios. But what we experienced this firsthand in our boat build. We have Pascal, 68 years old, 65 boats under his arms, Haneker and James's knowledge, the plans, and then all of that coming from James's decades of research on traditional boat building techniques of the Polynesians. And now we're adapting that to fit our needs, but also that, let's go back to that holistic perspective of how the boat will actually be used. It's not just about the boat building. And you mentioned that just before, in terms of not standardizing the clinker method, but the fact that, kits can be now, or designs can be purchased and then built together as a family to go out and enjoy the waterway. This is just a bigger picture of, the beautiful fruits of that knowledge being remembered forward, I think.
I think we're at a critical mass, because I think, again, the ability to work with our hands is something that is quite important, and I think as we go forward will be the most important talent that humans have. The intellectual knowledge is it is the most important IP that we can have as humanity, is the ability to make things with our hands and to have our human fingerprints on them. And I think without trying to track back to where I was thinking of going with that, to build and to catalyze excitement, I think there's such an opportunity. We're kind of geeking out over all of these things, but what I've loved is seeing people come in with their children, intergenerational families, grandparents coming in with grandkids, folks that would be my parents' age, volunteering in the longshed, sharing their knowledge of early maritime days with somebody my age, right? And just learning, and that transmission of knowledge And then just to have this sense, the size, what we have a unique opportunity at Sutton Hoo in the longship, the size of this ship is incredible. And to then tell this mythical story of it being discovered in the ground as, you know, the burial site for a king is a whole other set of myth and legend and lore. So it creates this awe. But the ship in and of itself is awe-inspiring. The cleaving of the logs, there is something that is, there is reverence that can be had over that act of making something. And I think that, again, and I run the risk of romanticizing it, because at the end of the day, you know, I in raising my family, I made a commitment to procuring, you know, organic foods. I was lucky enough to have the finances, but then also the elbow grease and the knowledge to be able to make my family from scratch meals. For if my children were on the line, they'd have, you can ask them 1,000 stories of me taking them foraging and this and that. But the you know, the elbow, I don't want to romanticize the amount of work, and you know this, that goes into making things from scratch. It's not easy.
Particularly in this current epoch that we're living in, where first of all you have to like give a caveat that you're aware that it's a privilege. Like, wow, it's become a privilege to have the time to go out and generate the knowledge of foraging food. Like, wow, that's, for me, sometimes when I think about that, it just stops me in my tracks of like, how did we get here? Where it now is a privilege to, you know, have the time and the resources to cook from scratch meals for our family, right? Or drink water that's clean, hopefully. Or, I mean, in our situation, the hand building of this boat is definitely not without sacrifice. Remy and I work full-time jobs, and we have 3 children, and we have to navigate all of that, and then really put in the extra yards. I wish we had it a lot easier and we could just focus only on the boat build. But yeah, it's quite phenomenal that we're at this point of time where we have to be careful of what we say here, instead of just, you know, being able to want to normalize things like that. So that's something that, yeah, I think is really important to flag there. The other thing is going back to this, the narratives, right? You and I love stories, and you know, it's the heart of the Floating Stories Lab. And from day one, when I first went to the fiberglass symposium at the University of Brighton a couple of years ago with Dr. Corinna Chokan as the only creative storyteller communications person amongst a room of people from the industry and then scientists, basically. The question was, you know, like, how do we communicate this problem with the wider public? And so that gets me kind of to the question that I'm revisiting over and over again, which is the narrative on ghost boats. They are romanticized. And there's this really interesting difference of viewing them right here that we're talking about, because I'm out in, you know, knee-deep mud in boat cemeteries that have maybe some more historical ships that are mostly wooden based, but still have polluting elements, a lot of paint, fiberglass wheelhouses, you know, a lot of the metal components are not healthy for the ecosystem. But these, let's say they have more of a story behind some of these boats. And then adjacent to that, just a lot of more modern mass-produced fiberglass boats that are dumped right next to these other ones. And then you're looking at this other burial site that's honestly, you know, the story behind it is fascinating. And then taking what you find there and then reconstructing it so you can get all this knowledge transfer, and also that ship can be experienced and I hope enjoyed once again. So how do we go from this situation I'm dealing with, where there are a lot of people here who really believe in the romanticization of the story of ghost boats and want to preserve these stories and therefore leave these boats in the water, and not necessarily seeing the pollution crisis that's come out of it, to getting rid of the pollution problem by removing the boats, but restoring the stories? Because as someone who's building a boat now from scratch, the idea that when I'm no longer here, my boat is washed up or abandoned by some future owner in an estuary and then polluting is horrifying for me. We've put so much love and attention, and that's not the boat's purpose, is to end up being this rotting, wrecked thing, right? So I'm curious. That's not a direct question to you. I just suffer from this conundrum like 24/7. And I find it interesting that you're looking at a very different boat burial site than we are, but they're kind of interconnected and how we change the narratives here.
Well, I think, I mean, you brought up multiple threads, and I think that in the tie that binds them all together, I think is connection. How might we create connection? And what that can look like. We can't protect what we don't know. We can't be impassioned about anything if we don't have an intimate connection to it. So reversing that from a sailing perspective, from a water perspective, from a food perspective, this is not something that is solvable by taking one boat out of a river. This is not solvable by one person abstaining to buy a fiberglass boat. This is a wicked problem that requires a systems, I might say a coordinated systems solution. That said, it is, I think, the opportunity, and this is where I think in my work, it's easy to become, in my food systems work, there have been a couple points where I was just done. Right. I think in my early 30s, my children were small. I'd put in a lot of elbow grease looking at the policy challenges in the United States, just this massive barriers to even public knowledge and public education. I was, from a systems perspective, it's not filled with hope or joy. Okay. And what I really found was, how might I restore my own hope and joy through these micro experiences, and almost even tending my own garden, if you will, tending my own boat shed, if you will, I guess. So it's like, on one hand, this isn't solved by any one project. At the same time, it's solved by making a personalized connection based on where somebody's at and what might be inspiring to them in a way that's relevant and meaningful. And it has to be fun. It has to be, we have to, in order for our planet to work out, well, at the end of the day, the planet's going to be fine. Like a planet.
In order for us to remain here, and work out on this planet.
Yeah, Dad was like, planet's going to sort itself. We're going to have my dad's favorite phrase was, you better hang on, or this isn't going to, this might not go well, right? So you better hang on, because this might not go well. We're kind of in this, like, this might not go well moment, right? So, but how do we create hope? Because we're at this moment where people are not hopeful. My children are, there's an entire generation where we are becoming indifferent. We're becoming apathetic. We don't see anything worth loving or fighting. Not even, I don't want to fight. What's worth loving? What if we shifted it to what's worth loving? And how might that shift the lens in which we problem solve and connect? And where do we find that commonality? Where can we find commonality? This is what I love about food. How, when we sit to the table and feed one another, in one of the most foundation, and what I love about floating stories and the approach of citizen science one of the most impactful experiences in my own career was working with the Edible Schoolyard out of Berkeley, California. That was early in my career. And I was working in Napa at the time in the wine business. And I was going down to Berkeley on weekends. When I told my dad I was moving to Northern California, I was leaving the San Francisco Yacht Club, just the Bay Area sailing. Dad's like, but there's no fresh water in Northern California. I'm like, Dad, but the sailing's good. He's like, he was very prophetic in some of his advice to me. So I'm working in Napa, going down to the Bay Area, working at the Edible Schoolyard again. Beautiful, beautiful place in the world. This school, Martin Luther King Jr., was a middle school serving 6th to 8th grade. So that would be about 11 to 13-year-old kids. And it was a very disadvantaged middle school. Lots of socioeconomic challenges. You had kids that hadn't had breakfast that morning going to school alongside children that had faculty, parents at faculty, very privileged children at UC Berkeley, all in the same pot. Massive, massive range of social experience. Lots of the kids had never even been to the Marin Headlands or even gone sailing on the bay, and the bay was visible from the parking lot there at the school. What the chef had done to bring into the school classroom was a garden and kitchen classroom to bring the students into a land-based learning experience where we would work alongside one another, grow food, and then prepare it in the kitchen. And one of the elements in the kitchen was, after we were done cooking for one another, was to set the table. And what we would do was teaching teams of like, I don't know, there's like 8 or 9 of us in each little cooking station. And part of what we did was to set a proper table, was to select a tablecloth from our linen cabinet, gather a vase and cut some flowers from outside from the garden, from our garden beds, from our flower beds, add beauty to the table, put a linen down, set a table with, proper silverware, and then sit down next to one another. These are kids, right? These are like 11 to 13. And they're like really tough kids, right? Like, 13-year-olds that are tough kids, right? And here we are having a moment of humanity and sharing. And where I'm going back with this is this opportunity around water has the same element and opportunity to connect. And that's where the magic is. There's a lot of really hard things we need to address. And again, they're wicked problems. It's not one magic bullet. It's not one solution. This is compounded over 70 years and then some, maybe 150. And then if we want to add colonialism, tack on a few more 100 years. It's like, where do we want to start the clock? Can't on an afternoon, and that's okay. And I think that's an important thing we need to start to normalize and articulate and be like, we can't solve this all today. No one partner can solve this all today. What might we do, as we did at that dinner table with my fellow student kids, as we're cooking up quinoas and kales and learning about foods from Africa and like all these different places. Remember how I said my upbringing in the Midwest wasn't exotic? Well, here we were learning things in this kitchen classroom that I had to travel across the ocean to learn, right? And here we are doing it from a garden with kids that did not have breakfast or most likely dinner the night before. But we were having this rich dialogue, this human exchange, this very human exchange, right? So I think that starting there, the lovely thing about what the Yacht Squadron did is it brought us all together in a space where we could start to make relationships again. That became really fractured. I love that we can Zoom. That's cool. But the relationship bit it became really fractured across pandemic. And we're really isolated, both in our industry silos and as individuals. So taking the analogy of the edible schoolyard and creating these connections, and like kids were out in the garden doing things like they'd never done. Like, Miss Rose, this is dirty. Miss Rose, this tastes nasty. All right, we can back this up. How do we create these sensory learning experiences, right? To create some receptor sites for new flavors, new tastes, and then from there, right? That's where the magic can happen. The same thing is for us in these boat stories. How might we create the love? The fear is a motivator. The fear, the science is real. The science, you know, the science around how the degrading fiberglass plays on microorganisms is horrific. And it's really horrific. I was born in Flint, Michigan. Flint, Michigan can't drink its water. I live in the United States. These things remain somehow incomprehensible to me, that that's a third world problem in a first world country. Like, these things are just very incomprehensible to me. The way, though, that we can go forward, and I just feel really strongly, is find something to love.
I think that having fun with dealing with modern society's most pressing issues, which are super complex, but kind of will come back to the same, you know, symptoms of the same kind of problem, being, you know, our capitalist industry and the whole world running on GDP as being, you know,
driver.
The driver, right? And it's like many people feel that if you're having fun, you're not taking it seriously. Yeah. You know, joy and having fun has seemed to become outlawed. Like, oh, if you're not angry, then you're not paying attention. I mean, anger is also a good driver. I lean towards more the anger side than the fear side. So I get the science makes me angry, and then that gets me out of bed every day. But what I have learned through the citizen science project that we've been running at Floating Stories Lab, which is, you know, bringing community members together to map end of life boat. Mapping seems to be a not sexy part of data collection in kind of the bigger picture of maybe what we might call conservation. Like, everyone wants to plant mangroves and seagrass and rescue turtles and, you know, do this kind of hands-on stuff, and data collection might not be so sexy, like counting birds or counting boats. But what I have found in my actual experience, first of all, we need the data. Like, we have to start from there, right? It's absolutely critical to gather this data. And then, as Corinne always says, we move forward from there grounded in logic, because there's a lot of these kind of like, let's act now, the planet is burning, we have to go. There's no time to gather data. Yes, there is time to gather data. And guess what? In the gathering of the data through the project that we've been doing, we've found joy, which is really weird to say, that walking around these boat cemeteries just like oozing pollution everywhere can be fun. But when you're together, when you are with other people who care about this or may not have been aware about it, and now that they're in front of it, they're caring about it, there is joy in that. And that's humans being human, that when we relate together in right relation, and when we're relating with our ecosystems in the right way, that's joyful. That's a joyful experience. The building of our boat has been similar, bringing people together for our volunteer days, having people show up from all over to come and help is always joyful. It's fun, even though it's really physically draining work some days. And, you know, we've got dust flying around everywhere from sanding Movingi and whatnot. Yeah. Then I want to tie back into two things that you talked about that I love: food and wine. So I can't live without champagne. and great food. I used to be a travel editor, and I actually was a luxury travel editor for many years, which is really interesting. And so I used to review luxury hotels and restaurants for a living, which is just a very interesting place to be on a completely different spectrum of that now and have that experience. I really appreciate. I mean, luxury food is mostly just organic farm to table food served really brilliantly, and a lot of slow, attentive processes, right? And tying back to the fact that that's luxurious and only available to people with a certain economic standing kind of blows my mind, right? But for our citizen science creative residency that we held in October here, and we have 2 more scheduled and a boat build residency, one of the biggest things was coming together around the food table with champagne and, ironically, oysters. Eating oysters with champagne, but coming around the food table, this big, beautiful, long table where we would all come together, beautiful little bunch of flowers in the middle. That's where the dialogue was happening, but also like sometimes more serious dialogue, and a lot of the times laughter and joy.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting how we can then center these kind of ideas like food and joy when talking about end-of-life boats and plastic pollution and this kind of thing, because it comes again back to connection. And I think of what I learned from the going back again to like Indigenous knowledge systems. I'm from Australia, even though I'm living in France now. I'm obviously a white Australian, so I have a different heritage, and my family history goes back to the UK, Wales, and Scotland, right? But growing up and understanding what I know about Aboriginal culture is that it depends on the individual, but at a particular age, let's say somewhere between, it could be as early as 11, there's no real number, it just depends on the individual. At some point in a child's life, they are initiated essentially to becoming an adult, right? And for boys, this might be going off and going bush on walkabout with some elders. And anyway, the point being is there's this pivotal moment in a child's life where they go from being the center of attention of the entire community, because these are intact communities, like the aunties and everyone's helping to raise a child, to the individual. You as an individual child are absolutely not important anymore. You mean nothing, but your contribution to the community as a community member is pivotal in the health of this community. And I think about that all the time. It goes back to what you were saying about, as one person, as one individual, and even as one discipline within an industry or one industry within a bigger picture, we cannot solve these problems, right? But we can come together and begin to unpick the threads, and start to really unpick the problems. And we're never going to get to solutions if we can't work together in these issues.
I think you are modeling, Floating Stories Lab, mapping the boats. I think it has to be done in partnership, and you're modeling, I think, the way to bring seemingly, I don't want to say disparate groups together, but I think it's starting to pull together those partners, non-traditional partnerships, and again, to have shared values of joy and creation and opportunities and dialogue. And I think part of the joy bit as well, and feeding each other is again that I'm probably overcorrecting in this nurturing bit, but I feel like it's a really important piece for us also to regulate, like to help regulate the nervous systems of our communities that are running really hot right now. So there is a unique opportunity, I think, through invitation and through, again, that like some of these ways of being together haven't yet been created, right? Like, so as my mind, you know, me coming down from Suffolk, like I love cross-pollination, and, you know, and then going backward and forward, and my daughter, who's 21, and wrapping up university, she's moving to the San Juan Islands for her summer between terms, to give sea kayaking tours. And so she's got all of the information. It's like, okay, well, how do we start to, through our informal networks, begin to make formal networks, right? And to start to scale and create, you know, what could it look like through a massive campaign to, you know, whether it's to take a page out of the playbook for beach cleanups, let's say, that have, you know, from like surf rider, because you're a surfer, you know, like how might we just maybe create a day where everybody goes mapping? I don't know. I'm making things up. But we need the data. We can make it fun. We can make it all in one, you know, in one set of days. What could that look like? How might the yacht squadron empower other yacht clubs to then send out teams of people to do this as a day? When the yacht squadron does this event next time, what might that look like to have a concentrated workshop to gather data? How might we work across, you know, again, across our networks, like mycelia, and just create this network, like the estuaries, again, using nature as metaphor to go out and then to put forward where we need to make the biggest impact. Because that is something, again, you know, put on a business hat, and where is the area of most need? Where is the area of most concentration? How might we springboard off of what we already know, you know, to address the estuaries and the river systems that like need the most help now? Because we do have to prioritize at the end of the day as well.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about the shared values, and for me, it just, you know, jumps out. Like, I mean, look at us. We're both wearing blue. Like, how we're on planet ocean. How is the ocean not our shared value, no matter where you live, right? It ties back to what you're saying about you have to understand things, I think, to best know how to interact with them from a custodian perspective. Helen Sersky's book, The Blue Machine, is our book for the Floating Stories Lab book club this month. And she's just mind blown that at this point in her career, when she's writing this book, that there's been no other book written that like really explains in a fun, playful, but scientific way how the bloody ocean works and why we do not exist without it. Like, we human beings will not be here. So what we're trying to do, I guess, with the citizen science work is, yeah, we're bringing together different groups of people for sure. But at the same time, we're all the same in terms of being dependent on functioning aquatic ecosystems. And then, yeah, from the position of a future design and how do we deal with the waste, this is all like actually quite fascinating now that I'm seeing people from different fields come together. We have 3 scientists coming in April here. So I'm facilitating a visit from Dr. Karina Chokin, Professor Frederick Cullen, who's a microbiologist, and his postdoctorate researcher, Yasmin. And Fred's coming to look in the sediment to see what the microbes are doing and seeing if, you know, in these legacy pollution boat cemetery sites, like how has that changed microbe behavior? Are they eating the fiberglass? Are they eating the plastic? You know, and that's fantastically like blowing my mind, because that's something I hadn't thought of. I think it's important that we like kind of play musical chairs here where we, you know, shift seats, because then we're shifting perspectives and looking at these problems from different kind of angles, which is, you know, if you lay down and look at a blade of grass and see it this way, you're going to have a much different perspective of what a blade of grass is, what it might be doing, and who's living inside of that blade of grass. So yeah, coming together with the shared values of ocean and aquatic ecosystems, but then finding ways for us to participate in custodianship, and data collection is a form of that in our present day in terms of what's needed, I think is super important. And that kind of brings me to you being in Cowes right now. Like, you stayed after the symposium, and I'd love to know why you're there. You're having a little pause on the Sutton Hoo project, so I want to know what you're doing right now, and what the future kind of looks like for you in the next like 6-12 months, short-term future.
Yeah, I think this was the best spot for me to pause. I love the sea, and I think that again, just to get some inspiration of where to focus my energy and where to invest. I think that the things that you're saying about our ocean networks, two things. One, I don't have an answer between the 6 and 12-month plan yet. Actually, I do.
You need to come here during that period of time.
Yeah, well, I'm lucky enough that my work's based back in New York, and I'm lucky enough to have the freedom to direct my research as I wish at this point. So doing it from the Solent is I think it's a magical moment. So I'm using this as a sabbatical period in the winter time until spring comes back online. And again, I guess using that strategy perspective to say, what is the area of most need that I could add value to elevate the most important work that's next is what I'm really crunching, doing some writing, doing some reflection. I think that those moments where we take a personal pause, this is more on the personal side of things, and consider the trajectory. We only have so many seasons in our adult lives. So like looking at, even my own 15 seasons, what does that look like? What can be orchestrated between this side of the Atlantic, New England, the Great Lakes, is right now, those are my, those are my anchor points. What opportunities, I think, here within Cowes, specific to Floating Stories Lab, I would love, you've got some excellent researchers layered over the milestone tentpole events that are coming online with the residencies this year, going down to it's not Saint-Tropez, in Douarnenez in July, is that correct?
In Douarnenez, yeah, in Audien, yeah.
Yep. So you've got some events coming up. How might we build around those tentpole events in the next bit to add further depth, perhaps not breadth, but maybe depth, and then, again, kind of ideate what's most important to move this mission forward, what's, to prioritize partnerships. I think that, like, I'm looking forward to learning more about what that could look like as well. Because I think, again, like I hate to use the word roadmap, a blue waterway of partnerships. Like, who are those key partners that could help advance the mission and get some quick traction and more data and resources, right? I think that's, at the end of the day, a lot of organizations, and I see this in food systems, see this in the craft heritage projects. We need to think definitely more from a collaboration and systems perspective, and even use like again, even just this knowledge share between you and I, having, I found Floating Stories because I loved the way you were engaging citizens in the broader conversation, taking that information, saying even to Sutton Hoo, like, look at this way that you're bringing in people and sharing the knowledge and sharing it out. Like, how might we continue to grow that? And then also inspire others to replicate similar systems and knowledge share. How do we circle back with the Royal Yacht Squadron of hosting perhaps a couple of school events in the fall? I'm riffing, but continual building towards something, and what is that vision, and what is that longer term goal. So that's like in the next bit, I'm happy to help support the team with that vision.
I love that. I mean, you're giving yourself this permission to pause, which again, like the whole joy thing is almost like illegal in our society right now. Like, you know, I just think of Remy in his work right now after having a broken neck and being forced to pause, and then kind of getting back into the corporate system. It's like the more you give, the more is then expected. It's not like you over deliver and then go take a break, you know. Like, he's experiencing that as someone who's a very hard worker and almost wanting to catch up for this time that he was forced to have off in the injury healing period. But this idea of pause is really interesting, because what I'm seeing around this issue, and it goes back to conversations that come up in some of the conferences, including at the symposium, is like, the world is burning, we have to act now. Actually, as Corinna says, acting now and rushing into action sometimes does more damage, right? Yeah. So that's where pause is actually pivotal. And then I think of living systems when I think about pause. So when we pause, our like living ecosystem of our bodies is never stopped. If it's pausing, we're dead, right? Like, there is constant work going on in here to keep us alive. Some organs may slow down when we rest and pause and sleep, but you know, like the dream state and the subconscious mind goes into overdrive when I'm sleeping. So that's this really interesting example of like, looking at pause from a living systems perspective. And what I'm thinking there is this need to say that pausing is not stopping work, because I know from interacting with you over the last, weeks, I mean, you've not stopped. You've just paused like this period of professional work per se in this particular place where you've been, and you've pivoted to maybe slow down certain things and then give space for the other work, the thinking, the reflection to take place, right? So it's kind of just like looking at pause as something that's quite different and very important. We need to pause, I think, a lot more when dealing with this problem, and just a lot of the problems we're looking at. Then there's other times when we need to be, sprinting and doing really hard work. It's about knowing when is the right time to do the slowing down and when is the right time to sort of scale up, right?
From that pause, I think, and it sounds a bit existential, and people that might listen might think, well, that seems like it is, and it is a privilege. It is our current system does not allow any pauses. Like, there's no pauses. I look at my own career to date and family that I've raised and relationships and all of this, and I was like, I did not pause. There was no pause in any of that. I mean, the colonial system is designed, the capitalistic system is designed to consume humans as inputs, just like fossil fuels, right? It's not regenerative. And I think by that pause allows us to restore our nervous systems. It allows us to hone our intuition. It allows us to pay attention. The non-reactive states. Now, I am a Leo. I am a fire sign girl. I can be called abrasive like the best of them.
I'm a Capricorn, sorry. I mean, I'm the goat with the horns. I'm thinking of this as radical resistance, right? Like, sometimes that pause is this radical resistance, and it's super necessary. It's again, something that's become this privilege. I get all the time like, oh my God, you have 3 kids. How do you do all of this? I mean, look, the honest truth is it's not without economic sacrifice for our family. Remy is the one at the moment going out to the corporate sphere 5 days a week. I am taking an economic pause, not necessarily by choice. I had a baby at 40, and babies need care, and you have less energy at 40. So working through the night is not something that I can do anymore. I used to do it with the kids with the boys when they were smaller. But I mean, how do I do all of this? Yeah, it's a lot, but what I'm doing is integrated and interconnected. So it doesn't feel like all of these siloed things, right? So if I go and take a walk, or if I go take a swim, which I'm not doing at the moment because it's bloody freezing, but in the summer, if I go and have a surf, those things for me are entangled. And that's actually my master's capstone I'm working on right now. It is called Entangled Practice. It's idea that creative practice, which, you know, I work in the creative industry, so creative practice is not inseparable from life, right? So I need to be doing all these kind of things that give me perspective, and the things that I do to pause is included in that, right? So it doesn't necessarily always have short-term economic benefits, and therefore it's not always an option for a lot of people. I actually love that Ireland just passed, I don't know what it's called, but they're actually, in COVID, they created this like a basic monthly income for artists, for creative people, and they've just made it permanent. And it showed that it's wild. It's like it's not that much. I want to say it's like a couple $100 a week or something. So you can't live off of it, but the results were more productivity and no economic loss for the arts industry and for the economy. So it's the same for 4-day work weeks. Like, all the evidence is there that balance of people's well-being is beneficial to economic values of our society.
I think the language that you're sharing, I think that the creative practice, I feel that, and to your point, it's like I look around even the table right now, and I've got books that I'm finally getting and my notes that I'm finally able to actually sit down and digest and reflect. Like, that is, it's not possible to do any meaningful work without a cyclical pause, and it is a creative practice. So I feel like from my retooling of the way that I want to work, so I like this dialogue because it gives us language to, I think, reframe what seems as a pause. Now, to your point, you know, it's like I do have some fellowship work and, you know, my own resources, but I also made a choice to downsize and to create a life that is much more lighter a footprint that allows me to do this. That is a choice. I don't have a 3,000 square foot home that I need to mow the lawn and, you know, pay for a golf club membership and all these things that are normal in the United States. I'm just riffing on this, right? I don't know that. That's a choice.
This is relative to the Floating Stories Lab boat build, you know. A Warren Polynesian inspired catamaran is a choice of design that is, for us, deliberate, right? We're choosing a boat that is very minimalist and strips back these other comforts on purpose and has a big open deck. I mean, we used to live in tents, so we're outside people, but deliberately has this deck where people, when they come on board and they come on voyages with us, gather again around food when you're in an anchorage or on moorings, as we have done with Hanneke's beautiful vessel, Spirit of Gaia. So that by design is on purpose. And this comes back to narrative and storytelling again, like how I've been often asking, how do I share the joy of minimalism with people? Because I've lived it for quite a long time, and I actually find myself the most stressed and the most disconnected from myself when I'm actually in the house. Like, you just asked my husband, after being with me for 9 years, we have our most difficult periods when I'm domesticated, essentially. Like I'm just, I'm adverse to that. But this boat choice is a choice, and by design, like on purpose. On the one side, with a knife and a rope, we'll be able to fix anything. on another hand, it's very affordable to build, like 60,000 euros, and we have ourselves a brand new catamaran that we can share and travel around the world with. So how do we, and the answer that I've come to with this is place-based experiences. How do I share that this experience of sailing out on this boat, stripped back from all the comforts of what modern life can give a lot of people, is going to be one of the wildest and most, memorable experiences of your life? Well, I'm going to take you on it with me, and you'll have that. I can't promise that everyone's going to have a positive experience, but we can't promise that. But I do know from personal experience that when people see that other ways of living are possible, and that, how do you experience the ocean really if you're on a luxury cruise ship? Okay, yes, you're on a boat and you're on the water and you're traveling. Okay, no, you're probably going to be like how many feet away from the ocean when you do that? Being on a warren, you're like literally at water's level,
Well, I think you bring up what the power of living authentically is. That is authentic to your person and to your family, and that's your journey, and you're sharing it. And what that does, it gives others permission to envision what's possible, right? It gives others, and I hear that actually quite frequently, again, being, mid-career. I hate the word middle age, but let's be honest.
Yeah. Those heat flashes are not going away.
I don't know what anybody else thinks. But it's again, even with my children, when it's become a bit of a dialogue with them as well, because we toggle back and forth. And I think at first it's like, oh, Ma's going rogue. From overseas, she's doing her own thing. But then I feel we're in this dialogue where we're giving each other in both directions permission to live our most authentic lives. And it's really, we have family meetings, and of course, like we want to make sure we're doing things that are we do live in the 3G, right? We still gotta feed ourselves and make sure that, in the United States, we have health insurance and that sort of thing, right? There are some things that we need to be mindful of. And this does come from a great privilege, but it is also quite deliberate. And we have, and it does also take a tremendous amount of courage, right? Mm-hmm. And I recognize that in you and your family, that you are choosing a way to model what's possible for people that may not ever consider otherwise. And I think that in of itself should be recognized and applauded, and remind yourself of it when nobody else does.
Oh, I really appreciate that. That's lovely. I mean, I guess in what we're doing and the way that it's come about, and you would have heard a very rapid fire version of this at the symposium, is that it went from this real uncomfortability of wanting to change things that I was grappling with, flying all around the world, making climate change documentaries, right? That just didn't feel right. And then wanting to not be apart from my family so much. And again, wanting to be back into the more the nomadic living. Realizing that sailing was an avenue and that a sailboat was a vessel for those things to be possible, and yet then so inaccessible, right?
Yeah.
Learning to sail in the part of the world where we were at the time, southwest of France, was expensive, and no one was opening, the door or the hatch, to use a sailing term, welcoming our family of 4 at the time on board to go out for sailing experiences. Like, we had to pay for lessons. And that's not the same story for everyone. In Brittany, for sure, way more opportunities to go sailing with folks, more affordable. But I was just infuriated that the access, and this goes back to this whole talk of privilege, right? This access to land, to dig your hands in the soil and learn how to grow a garden and all of this access has become so shut off and only for the very elite, the privileged and the rich, and even the wealthy middle class. And for me, that's not how we're going to get any closer to a healthier living ecosystem on the planet that we need to survive as humans. So the Floating Stories Lab really became about creating access to having these ocean experiences. And then, it just has really snowballed from there, having access to build a boat, having access to participate in citizen science, having access to art science residencies, where you don't have to have $3,000 to go to a creative retreat, like the ones that we've been holding are free or just covering costs, right? So access is really important to me. And yeah, I think we can close maybe going to some reflections that you've had over your career and kind of where you're at right now, in how we create better avenues of access. Because like you said, even where you come from in the anthropology space, very colonial, and doesn't need to be, because the study of ourselves and our planet and each other is something that should be accessible and have multiple voices contributing, right?
I think that, yeah, I think that that's moving forward. I think partnership that is, we recognize the equity that we all bring to the table, and the equity and ensure and put up, I don't like the word guardrails, but part of the value set is that it be regenerative, that we're putting it forward, that we're leaving things with more carbon in the tank than we've extracted. How we get there, that's part of the journey, right? And how we problem solve, doing that in a way that is, again, fun, joyous. Again, I don't have answers for all of these. These are just some of the things, like somatically, even I'm trying to find my way forward. Who do I want to partner with? Where do I want to do my work? What relationships do I want to maintain? What feels right? What feels like there could be a long arc of potential here that can add value, and rising tide lifts all boats. Again, I'm kind of giving myself my own framework, creating a framework that allows me to have these pillars to make decisions on how I engage with the world. That then can scale. What might that look like? How might that look? I can show up for my fullest self if I make sure that my brain is in the right spot, that I've gone for my walk, that I've fed myself, that I've, like, how do I make sure I'm the best partner for you to work with, and vice versa, right?
Totally.
So practice with my children, how do we show up for each other fully and contribute as meaning, and then also show compassion. These are very basic things, but I think very important to revisit when we're talking about creating community and creating partnership and creating grace and fun and joy.
Yeah, there's a humility in it, isn't there? This, again, stepping back and going, I as the individual, are kind of less important as my role in this community. And then part of me playing a positive role and a right story in this community is, one, making sure I'm showing up in my best state as much as possible, which means fed, rested, brain ready to interact and collaborate. And then stepping into these collaborations with the right intentions. And I think from a perspective of, I need to listen here quite a lot, because, I might be trained in a particular way, or I might have spent 10, 15 years in this particular profession and may have all these accolades, but we're stepping into new ground now. We are dealing with problems that our species might not have had to deal with before. I mean, the fiberglass has been around for what, under 100 years, and no one thought of what to do with it when it reached its end of life. So here we are with this new contaminant problem. And we might need to just step back from our little pedestals of our industries and professions, and come together with humility, right? Yeah. Sorry, what did you say?
Beginner's mind, and from a place of curiosity, and what might be
involved is honestly, I scream it out the window every day. Like, every one of these conferences, like, so how do we do this and how do we do that? I'm like, ask the kids, bring the youth in. Let's create these environments where the youth feel like they're not just being taught by us, and they're able to, like, we're able to learn together, you know.
I think that from a pedagogy perspective, you know, taking the theory and the applied and the ways that we learn, and it's very much learn by doing. It's having a childlike mind, a curiosity, beginner's mind. Check our assumptions at the door. It's very, very, very basic.
Yeah.
But we have to untangle the same thinking that got us here is not going to get us out of what we're in. We have to create new relationships, new neural pathways, new ways of doing things, and we have to do that with intention and with and being deliberate and being okay with not knowing how to fit different puzzle pieces together, because the ways that we could possibly do it, we don't know yet.
Yeah.
And I think that that's incredibly valuable. And I love that you bring up the word humility. To have humility that we don't know. We each bring a tremendous amount of knowledge, and we're each necessary in putting these puzzle pieces together. But we just have to continue to be open and receptive to each other's experiences, and to your point, to listen and to be curious about perspectives that are seemingly different than ours. And that's not easy as well.
No.
So I think
dialoguing about this is just so critical. I think dialoguing about problems and solutions, it's like when we come together and dialogue about it with people from different walks of life and ages, and that is when you think you might have had a great idea, and then you dialogue with this person over there and they're like, actually, so cool. From my experience and what I've learned and who I spoke to, so this idea of improving our relationships, which is very hard, I think, but critical, our relationship with each other, our relationship with the land, and it requires humility.
That's not easy, is it?
No. That will just leave everyone with that thought. How do we become more humble? Hey, you know what? Go out in the ocean in a very minimalist boat, and you will be humbled. So there you go. Ocean is our teacher, as always.
She is, isn't she? Well, thank you for all that you bring to the world and the opportunity.
Thank you to you. I really appreciate you taking the time to have this very winding path discussion. I really enjoyed it.
It's a good journey. Thank you for the invitation to come along on it with you.
Thank you so much. Have a nice afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.